right, folks, thank you so much for joining us. My name's Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services here at the Tewksbury Public Library. Want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Foundation for sponsoring tonight's author visit and sponsoring all our in-person and virtual author visits this summer. I also want to thank Jason Marshall from Tewksbury Telemedia, who's here live streaming this on YouTube and also on the town's local access TV station. I want to they couldn't be here in person, but I want to thank Debbie and Dan Sullivan from the Book Oasis, local bookstore in Stoneham, for providing copies of tonight's book. And most of all, I want to thank those watching at home, and especially those that came out and you're here in the room. And it's nice to have an audience in the room, so thank you all for being here. And so if anyone has any cell phones on them, they want to turn those to vibrate or silent. Restrooms down the hall on the right before you get to the front desk. And just a reminder for those that are watching on YouTube, the comments are disabled, so if you want to ask a question or make a comment during the Q&A, you're going to have to email me, and I just sent you all an email this afternoon, and again about 15 minutes ago. Okay, so let me get to the good stuff here. Tonight's program is entitled Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten Story of the Christian Front. So author Charles Gallagher is here to discuss his latest book, the aforementioned Nazis of Copley Square. I won't get too much into this. I'll read a little bit from the description. This is the forgotten history of American terrorists who, in the name of God, conspired to overthrow the government and form an alliance with Hitler. Back on January 13th, 1940, FBI agents burst into the homes and offices of 17 members of the Christian Front, seizing guns, ammunition, and homemade bombs. J. Edgar Hoover's charges were incendiary. The group, he alleged, was planning to incite a revolution and install a temporary dictatorship in order to stamp out Jewish and communist influence in the United States. Ooh, so hopefully I've whet your appetite. Okay, so a little bit about Mr. Gallagher here. So Charles R. Gallagher is the Associate Professor of History at Boston College. Go Eagles. His first book, Vatican's Secret Diplomacy, won the John Gilmary Shea Prize from the American Catholic Historical Association. And again, want to thank the Corning Foundation and the Friends of the Tewksbury Library. So all 50 or so watching at home and those in the room, let's give a big round of applause to Mr. Gallagher for being with us tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert, for that very kind introduction. Thank you also, Jason, for your help with the technology. The title of the book is Nazis of Copley Square. Before I came out tonight, I searched all of my FBI documents, about 3,500 pages of FBI documents to see if there are any Nazis in Tewksbury. But I'm happy to say there were no Nazis in Tewksbury, at least according to the FBI back in the 1940s, but there were Nazis in Copley Square. In fact, a very high-profile Nazi SS officer was up on Beacon Hill under diplomatic cover, doing a lot of nefarious activity, which I relate in the book. And of course, it's a relationship. It's a discovery that had gone unnoticed for the last 80 years or 75 years. And so the book is. The Christian Front organization had been known to journalists at the time and to historians, but the national security documentation around the group, the FBI file, had all been classified, and I was able to get those declassified and use them. And when I started to work in the primary source material and also travel to Germany and work in Nazi documents from the political archives of the Third Reich, it was pretty jaw-dropping stuff, and I kind of couldn't believe what I was looking at. Just a little bit about the title of the book, Nazis of Copley Square. You know, it takes about 2 years to get each FBI file released, so I had to wait 6 years to get all of the 3 files I needed, and so I was walking around the campus at Boston College, and people would say, what are you working on? Because you're always supposed to be writing a new book. And I'd say, oh, I'm writing a book about Nazis in Boston and the Catholics who loved them. But people would just laugh at you and they say, oh yeah, Nazis in Boston. Like they weren't sure whether I was writing a comic book or whether I was kind of fantasizing about this, but it's actually quite a revealing story and very chilling in a lot of ways. So why Copley Square? This is the Nazi. His name is Herbert Scholz. He very rarely wore his SS uniform after he was given diplomatic cover by the German Foreign Office, particularly the Nazi Party. He was the representative of the Nazi Party in the German embassy in Washington. He came to Boston in November of 1938 as the consul. So he's the Nazi. This is his target, a guy named Francis P. Moran, who grew up in Dorchester, Roxbury and Dorchester. He was a follower of the radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, who himself, we now know, was having various interactions with German intelligence in the United States in the 1930s. And he was, we might say, a disciple of Father Coughlin's in Boston. He was very charismatic, very intelligent guy. More about him later, but he became the target for Scholz's recruitment. The other thing to remember about Scholz is that he's a master spy. One of his first jobs in Germany was as aide-de-camp to Rudolf Hess, who would become deputy Führer. He was kind of second in command under Hitler by 1933-34. And Hess was known as the espionage wonk for the Nazi Party, and Hitler deferred to Hess about espionage activities. Scholz was, and more about Scholz later, but he was a very effective spy, not only in Boston, but throughout New England with recruitment, penetration of military sites, and gaining technical information for the Nazis. Again, until the book was published late last year, nobody knew anything about this. And again, when I was researching and writing it, it was just pretty jaw-dropping what I was finding. So how did they end up in Copley Square, especially when we heard about a revolution in New York? Well, after the revolutionaries were caught by the FBI, the Christian Front moved up to Boston, and they had their headquarters in the Copley Square Hotel, which has just had a grand reopening, in fact, a couple months ago. Apparently, it had been shuttered for about 2 years, all during the pandemic. And apparently it's just reopened, and it's in good form these days. I haven't gone in yet. I actually know the exact number of the room where the headquarters of the Christian Front was, but I won't say that publicly. So Copley Square Hotel is not the Marriott Copley, it's not the Fairmont Copley, it's just a small hotel across from the Heinz Convention Center now. It was built in the 1890s. I think it still retains the floor plan because the rooms are very small there. That's the main complaint on hotels.com reviews. But one of its, I think Babe Ruth used to live there when he was pitching for the Red Sox. And it's got a beautiful, it had a beautiful lobby back in the day. So what is the Christian Front? It's a religious term that, and I'm just going to rush through this because I want to get to the Q&A as quickly as possible. So the Christian Front was a term devised by a theologian in Britain in the 1930s. A guy named Sir Arnold Lunn, who had converted from Methodism to Roman Catholicism while he was at Oxford in the 30s. And he decided that what he saw as communist persecutions happening throughout the globe, and particularly in Europe, that Christians could unite together in a certain high level of moral force against the global communist movement, which he thought was attempting to eradicate Christianity in Western Europe. And so what he wanted to do was use this concept of a Christian front, which was to be ecumenical in nature and religious only in nature, and as a moral force to unite against the onward advance of communism. He wanted to mend the rifts of the Reformation, so the 500 years of Reformation fractures, he said, could be mended through a common front against global communism. It got picked up, this idea of the Christian front, which was more or less benign and theological in nature, was picked up by Father Coughlin in New York, and in the book I argue that he took the concept and paramilitarized it. He actually gave it teeth. He gave it more than teeth. He gave it bullets and weapons and eventually bombs. And so these are, what I engage in the book are these concepts that push the activity of the terrorism and the activity of the espionage forward. You can read about these in the book. They're rather sophisticated. The concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, that means that the mythical concept that Jews and communists are not only symbiotic in nature, but were created of the same cloth, created at the same time. That Lenin's Judaism and Marx's Judaism combined to create this new political religion, this new secular religion that would eradicate any opposition, particularly anything metaphysical, which would be Christianity itself. At the time that Judeo-Bolshevism is growing in the minds of the Christian fronters, the theology in place, particularly for Roman Catholics, was something called Catholic Action, which was originally a social uplift movement, but became a global social movement in itself, and then a theological movement called the Mystical Body of Christ theology, which was based in the letters of St. Paul, indicating that all baptized Christians throughout the globe carried a kind of an identification transnationally with each other through their baptism. So that basically borders didn't exist, nationalities didn't exist. What merged into the mystical body of Christ was a group of co-religionists gathered throughout the world, and that notion of the body, that if one part of the body is injured, all other parts of the body feel that pain and feel that injury. So that if communists, which they did, were persecuting and killing, murdering thousands of Catholic officials in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, or in Mexico in the 1920s. If communists were doing that in Spain, then Catholics in Boston could feel that pain and register that pain theologically through membership in the mystical body of Christ. And so consequently, there was this sense of our co-religionists being murdered abroad, and a level of desire to avenge that type of activity on the part of global communism. So this is what eventually happened in January of 1940. Father Coughlin, through his theological twisting of the gospel, kind of permits these guys to take up these weapons. Take up these weapons. These are Springfield M19, 1919 rifles. They are weapons of war. They have a 5-round clip. It's a bolt-action rifle. Shoots what's called a 30-06 bullet, which is about 3 inches long, and each single bullet will go through a brick wall. It's actually more. It's actually a more lethal bullet than what NATO carries today. Mainly, the Americans don't carry them. NATO doesn't carry them because you can carry more smaller bullets than you can these big giant bullets. But they'll take out a whole brick wall with one bullet if they need to. They're weapons of war that they were able to get through membership in the National Rifle Association. Back then, if you were a member of the National Rifle Association, you could write to an office in the Department of War, which is now our Department of Defense, called the Department of Civilian Marksmanship. And for $7.50, you could have a military-grade rifle shipped to your local armory, and for an extra $1.50, they would ship it to your doorstep. Also, ammunition, targets, other materials for target practice. It's an excellent, excellent gun, by the way. This gun was used up to through the Korean War. It's a very, very good gun on the battlefield. But it's a battlefield weapon, right? So this is what the folks in New York were up to. Father Coughlin's group, the Christian Front, was very active in New York, and both New York and Boston had its own leaders. In New York, the main leader was a guy named John F. Cassidy here. Cassidy was a fervent anti-communist who had kind of flitted around on the anti-communist fringe in the 1930s in New York. He kind of tried his luck at putting together a couple of different neighborhood anti-communist organizations. Nothing really stuck until he also decided to travel to Michigan and get Father Coughlin's blessing to start a Christian Front chapter in New York. So this is their group at target practice. So I should say, at its peak in the late 1930s, 1939, 1940, it had about 100,000 members all up and down the East Coast. The largest chapters were in New York, Boston, New England, and Philadelphia. There were some in the Midwest. There was some interest in Chicago, and a small chapter in Cincinnati. But I should say that of these 100,000, most of them joined the organization with a very public-facing Christian militancy. And then once you joined, you had to fill out a membership card, and you had to put on the membership card whether you'd ever served in the armed forces and in what capacity. Once they got your membership card, then Cassidy and Moran would sift through those, and they would see who had military experience, and those members would be recruited into smaller cell units which would paramilitarize. So the people you see here, they're at their target practice in Narrowsburg, New York. That's an FBI photo. Now look at, I mean, they're loaded for war. And they were called the Action Committee. So these cells were really only about 12 to 17 men each in each city, each neighborhood. So keeping in mind too that the other kind of 99,000 members of the Christian Front out there who were members had no idea that these paramilitarized units existed, which were under the command. Barely got through law school at St. John's and took the New York bar 3 times and flunked it. So he became basically another disciple of Father Coughlin and kind of devoted himself to this new movement. So this is, I say, on that I say prayer and target practice because on one FBI report they talk about their target practice in Narrowsburg and how they got up 6 a.m., did their military target practice, broke at 9 a.m., went to Catholic Mass in Hazleton, Pennsylvania for an hour, came back, and then did military rushes again on the target practice field. So the FBI found that interesting. I also found that very interesting as well. Stop shooting your guns in order to go to Mass, you know. Publicized an event in January of 1940, and I was shocked when I early on, as an undergraduate student, wanted to write a history paper about this group, and my teacher dissuaded me from doing that, saying that they didn't matter and they never did anything, so write your paper on some other topic. I just thought Christians with guns and bombs was kind of cool. I mean, my personal background, when I was in college, I was a summer police officer and also being trained in semi-automatic weaponry, and I was trained on a Remington single pump shotgun. So I actually knew what a Springfield 1919 could do, and I kind of knew it wasn't a joke. So they got, they eventually, the New York Christian fronters got put on trial, and then they did not get convicted. You can read about that in the book. Let's suffice it to say that the prosecutor for the Department of Justice was probably the smartest dumb guy that ever graduated from Harvard Law School. He, in multiple cases, he was also the guy, and I know I'm on YouTube, but this cat, I've read his papers up at Harvard Law School. He's like, his prosecution skills are just horrific. I mean, he has no sense of syllogistic logic whatsoever. And so he's kind of been lost to history. I think it's okay for him to be lost to history. You can read about him in the book. But he couldn't get these guys prosecuted. There was another huge sedition case that he tried to argue in 1942, 1944. That was a complete disaster. So anyway, due to the inept prosecution, mainly from the Department of Justice, they got off. However, there are elements of religion, there are elements of culture that kind of move in. But nonetheless, they were all kind of nolo prost. In other words, they kind of similar to getting acquitted. The first thing John Cassidy did once he heard of his acquittal was go up to the judge and ask for his guns back, which the judge, by law, had to give him. So, because they were legally possessed, because they were not, so the FBI was, that's the other thing, the FBI was convinced they were going to put these cats away for 35 years on each gun charge, on each weapons charge, for stealing weapons from an armory, because they were convinced that they stole them from an armory. It's the only place you could get them, as far as they knew. The FBI had no clue you could write to the War Department through the NRA and get guns in the mail and have it be legal. So that's another kind of, ineptitude. So then after the publicity in New York, the revolutionaries there kind of shuts it down. I can talk about their, and you can read about in the book, their actual plan to create a revolution. They had a clear plan about what they wanted to do, how they wanted to overthrow the US, what the impact was, what the impulses were that they were aiming for, how they were going to do it. It's all in the book. It's pretty cool too. But we can talk about that later. Because of that prosecution getting all the headlines in New York, it moves up to Boston and comes in contact with Moran, starts leading the charge in Boston. Moran lays low all through the months of the trial, through the spring and summer of 1940. And when the acquittal comes, it gives him new life, because he says to his Christian Front followers in Boston that now the Christian Front is nothing more than a Catholic Christian patriotic organization, and membership starts to increase greatly after the acquittal in June of 1940. The problem is, and one of the reasons I think the membership increases, is that Moran, we know by July of 1940, is meeting secretly with Scholz here. And this is Scholz's pedigree. He got a PhD in psychology from the University of Leipzig. His fabulously wealthy. In order to spurn his father, he drops out of college and joins the Brown Shirts, led by this guy, quite famous, Ernst Röhm. He and Hitler set up the Brown Shirt organization. We've all heard of the Brown Shirts. And then at the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, June of 1934, Röhm is pinpointed by Hitler for execution, and Scholz decides, quite previous to that, a few months previous to that, Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, moves in to recruit Scholz out from under the nose of Röhm, because Scholz has that PhD and his SS is looking for more prestige with Hitler. He wants highly educated, cultured individuals to be a member of the SS. At the Night of the Long Knives, when Röhm is kind of kidnapped and then later killed, Scholz goes and escapes, and through the help of Himmler, his life is saved. And then Scholz becomes allied to Himmler. Himmler immediately, and Hitler himself, set Scholz up with his first job, which is working under Rudolf Hess. So this is the guy that comes to Boston as the German consul. Like everybody in Boston, nobody knows this in Boston when he comes, but this is his pedigree. And Scholz has worked in the Brown House, the Nazi Party headquarters in Munich, for almost 2 years by this point. Again, it's because he's a really good spy, because he keeps a low profile. Most people have no idea who he is. In fact, the press had no idea who he was when he showed up in Boston. In fact, the press in Boston, New York, and Washington said that Scholz had been sent to Boston because he'd made a diplomatic faux pas at some sort of reception in Washington. But that wasn't the case at all. He was here because this man, who is the former Chancellor of Germany, the last really substantial Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, was teaching at Harvard and living in Boston, living in Cambridge. And after Kristallnacht, Heinrich Brüning began to make more anti-Hitler speeches. And so Himmler in particular noticed this, and they wanted, when the Nazis want to shut you up, they're quite good at turning the clamps, so they sent Scholz to Boston to shut down Brüning's public speaking. And also Brüning was conspiring with a guy named von Trott to actually have the US State Department help overthrow Hitler in Germany. This is in 1938, 39, 40. And von Trott goes back to Germany, and he's caught up in the Operation Valkyrie, the Klaus von Stauffenberg situation, the assassination attempt in 1944. But he's in Boston. Von Trott's here meeting in Boston with Brüning in the 40s. So it's like these kind of strings and webs of things that kind of attach themselves to these major events are just kind of unfolding as you kind of go through the book. This is some more photos of Scholz. He was known as Handsome Herbert. He was a real socialite, brilliant guy. At age 16, he went to a high school in Bavaria that was known for its languages. So by the time he graduated at age 19, he knew 6 different languages fluently, and one of them was English. And he fell in love with Lilo von Schnitzler, who is the beautiful Lilo. And Lilo's father was Georg von Schnitzler, who was the commercial chief of a company called IG Farben, which is the largest chemical company in the world at the time. It's now Bayer. If you Bayer Chemical, you can take Bayer aspirin when you get a headache. And there's Herbert looking quite well with Lilo. She's actually quite a beauty. Also studied at the London School of Economics, fluent in English. But they're also very hard-line ideological Nazis. Just a picture of Scholz in the consulate on Beacon Street. This is him in July of 1941, where he's finding out about President Roosevelt dismissing all of the consuls. These are some things and then his next assignment was to go to Budapest. Admiral Horthy there. Hitler thought Horthy was a little bit too soft on the Jews because he wasn't deporting them fast enough. So guess who he sends to Budapest to turn the clamps on the regent king of Budapest is none other than Scholz, which ultimately happens. This is a rather chilling photo, I think. This is Beacon Hill. This is about 2 blocks from the State House. It's 39 Chestnut. And that's the spring of 1940 on the occasion of Hitler's birthday, but they kept it flying because of the continuous victories in the Low Countries during that spring of 1940, when it was felt that all of Europe was going to go under the Nazi yoke. I mean, France was about to fall. It was just a really, really tough time. So Christian Front membership in New England, 1941, the FBI clocks it at about 30,000. You're getting more local participation of clergy at this time. Scholz, from what I can see, Moran, from what I can see ideologically in terms of what he's doing in his activity, my guess is that he starts meeting with Scholz in the spring of 1940. but we don't have documentary evidence about him meeting secretly with Scholz until July of 1940. Now, the interesting piece about Moran is that after high school, he attended a Roman Catholic seminary for the Franciscans in upstate New York. That seminary was populated, the faculty was made up of German Franciscans who had been kicked out of Germany under Bismarck. And it was while he was in the seminary that Moran himself became fluent in German. So when he went to the consulate on Chestnut Street to meet secretly with Scholz, and the FBI couldn't ever get wiretaps or couldn't ever find out about this, because what Scholz has done is he indicated that he lined the entire first floor of the consulate. All the walls were lined with lead, and the FBI couldn't overhear anything they were saying. And they were speaking in German, and Moran had a code name, and they became really fast friends. The other thing is that I actually gave a paper on this over the summer at a conference, actually for spies in Italy, and his psychology, I actually studied I got a copy of his dissertation in psychology, and it's just what he wrote about as a psychologist is just perfect for recruiting agents. Like how to use psychology to get people to do things that you want them to do. And that's what Scholz did his dissertation on. And so when he meets with Moran, Moran is completely taken in, and he's kind of mesmerized by Scholz. And Scholz is perfect at getting an ordinary American working class Catholic to actually integrate Nazi ideology. Now, the other thing I like to show here is that there were 5 organizations surveilling Moran and Scholz. None of them were able to discover that Moran had a relationship with Scholz. So we don't find that out until the book is published last year. So you've got FBI counterintelligence, U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. They were the closest to figuring it out. U.S. Army counterintelligence, the Office of Strategic Services, and then the Boston Police Department. So the FBI placed most surveillance on Scholz and the most surveillance on Moran. They still were never to make the connection that one was the agent of the other. Scholz was that good. He ran circles around the FBI. So in this narrative, the FBI stands for fabulous but incompetent. So there's another reason why the FBI can't get the goods on Scholz, and that's because every time they get close to getting an informant inside Scholz's circle, the informant refuses to talk because they're afraid Scholz will have them killed. And you find this over and over again. From 1940 up through 1944, they were almost about to get an informant that had broken into the cell structure of the Christian Front to testify. But that woman, who was just known as Informant T1, refused to testify in a court of law again because she was afraid about reprisals. Particularly, they were afraid of getting killed. This is one of Adolf Hitler's military advisors, Fritz Fenthal, again, someone who no one's ever heard of. He came to Chestnut Hill. Scholz lived in Chestnut Hill, about 5 minutes from my office at Boston College. He lived right on the Chestnut Hill Reservoir in a beautiful mansion, the only one with a tennis court, actually. Fenthal was a military aide, and it was right after Fenthal goes to Russia, China, Japan, and then comes to Boston in May of 1940. He spends 4 days with Scholz in Chestnut Hill. It's after that discussion with Fenthal that Scholz ramps up his military espionage, so espionage against military targets, particularly U.S. naval bases, Army bases in New England, and then also there was something called the New England Defense Consortium, which was basically a group of all the universities in New England that were doing military research. This particularly MIT and Harvard, Scholz penetrated that within months of the meeting with Fenthal. And that was kept classified until after the war. When the FBI discovered that he had done this in the middle of the war, like 1943, they didn't want any other agency in the government to know that basically the Germans had penetrated R&D in New England anyway. And that was kept classified by the FBI up until 1945, till the end of the war. This is Moran, this is Hibernian Hall, this is Father Coughlin. And of course, Moran's able to do this because the First Amendment allows for free speech and also allows for religious expression. And so Scholz, again, is winning on those two fronts against any surveillance that the US can place against him, because the FBI has to be cognizant of free speech protections and religious expression. They never dealt with, and this is the interesting part, I think Scholz is a genius for using a religious organization to do espionage work because of that First Amendment protection. And the FBI is very queasy. Now, they're all Catholics from Fordham and Marquette who are FBI agents, and even they're queasy about like trying to infiltrate a Catholic organization. So there's this proclivity to just kind of let them go unless they can do anything. Now, this is in the book, you'll find out about Scholz giving lectures at Camp Edwards, actually stirring up trouble at Camp Edwards and Fort Devens. And then, so he's allowed, because he passes himself off as a religious leader, he's allowed to go give religious lectures in the army camps and then comes back and gives the specifics of the camps to Scholz. And this is technical information that the Germans simply did not have. And they were really whetting their appetite for it. There was also, in the book, you'll find out, there was a guy from Boston named Maynard Melvin Johnson invented a semi-automatic rifle, which was being put up to be the main battle weapon of the US Army by 1939 and 1940. The Johnson rifle had been purchased by the Dutch to the tune of about 30,000. So when the Germans rolled through Holland, they also came in possession of 30,000 Johnson rifles. This sounds very strange to our ears, but the Germans, for the life of them, could not engineer a semi-automatic rifle. They found it very hard to do. In fact, they had a Gewehr 41 and a Gewehr 42 because they couldn't get it right the first time. So what they wanted to do, they had the Johnson rifle in their possession, so they knew what they needed to do to outgun that weapon on the battlefield. They could not get the technical specs to the M1 Garand, actually thanks to an excellent counterintelligence operation run by the FBI. So the FBI kept that away from the Germans. But they wanted, so basically what Scholz did was he used the Christian Front in Boston to start a letter writing campaign, a picketing campaign, start meetings, having public lectures about having the US Army adopt the Johnson rifle. So it's this religious organization really amping it up publicly about what rifle the Army should have. The FBI didn't put two and two together. And this is the Senate Armed Services Committee actually debating this on the floor of the Senate. Now you'll never see this on the Senate. Again, they got like a bunch of different semi-automatic rifles on the floor of the Senate, and they all did. Okay, all right. Oh yeah. Good point. So anyway, this is just something I put in the book because I think so many times the historians dismiss religion as kind of a soft subject, and the real history is the military history, what goes on the battlefield, or it's the economic history. Well, this is a religious organization could have possibly, now it failed, but it could have possibly trying to affect the dynamics of the battlefield in Europe, and all kind of emanating here from Boston. So I wanted to put that in. This is a picture of Johnson. He was a graduate of Harvard, a Marine Corps reservist, and a graduate of Harvard Law School. It's really an excellent rifle. It was used by the Marines in the Pacific because it was so light. In the middle of all this, the British intelligence realized that the FBI was not making any, well, what they realized was that the Christian Front was becoming extremely active in Boston. The British were monitoring US radio broadcasts. And in the summer of 1940, a Jesuit priest from Boston College, yes, my institution, after the acquittal of the New York insurrectionists, if you will, he gave a speech giving religious permission for Catholics in Boston to join the Christian Front again. And that pushed the uptick in membership. And he spoke on the radio for an hour and gave all of his theological justifications for this. So I look at that in the book. The British were monitoring that radio broadcast as they did. And they decided that they would take things into their own hands, and that they would, for the first time since 1776, the British would come to American soil and run an operation illegally against the Americans. This is basically what's happening. So they set up a front organization, which is headquartered in the Little Building, which is across from the Public Garden. It's now, I think, Emerson College owns the building. And they call it's basically a neighborhood group, like a neighborhood watch group. And they're called the Irish American Defense Association. They're very pro-Roosevelt and pro-interventionism. They can't find anybody to run the organization. They do it through a lot of spy activity, a thing called a cutout. There's a lot of tradecraft going on. The British are really excellent spies here. They run a terrific front organization here. You can read about it in the book. There's a lot of sophisticated spy stuff going on in this case. And they eventually recruit a woman named Frances Sweeney, who is a devout Catholic from Boston who had left-wing leanings. So she was kind of one of the 12 members of the Catholic left in Boston at the time. And she was sympathetic to communism, sympathetic to a lot of liberal causes. And they, in fact, the British agent who was in charge of doing the recruitment settled on her as the leader of the group. And she was kind of an energetic, very zealous, very committed, very well organized anti-fascist. And she believed that anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics was a sin morally. So all these Christian fronters were actually, for her, this was a religious vocational issue, that she needed to stamp out the Christian front in Boston, not for political reasons, but because her religion told her so. She had no idea that she was being run by MI6, by British intelligence. She had no idea about that. She didn't ask where her paychecks were coming from, and the British really covered their tracks well with the money issue too. They had plenty of money. British intelligence, man, that's a silver spoon operation during World War II. They set her up in a palace there in the Little Building. So these are some of the just images of some of the secret documents that I found in London that kind of explained the whole situation. These were just declassified, like in 2017, and they had been kept classified for years. And I was able to kind of put the puzzle together. Now these are all code names. I had to figure out this code name. I finally figured out who that code name was. It took me about 3 years to figure out who you was. I talked to a number of historians who deal with espionage matters, and these code names here. Some of the code names are well known, others just weren't known. These are some of the code names. But this is a pretty high up. Alexander Cadogan, who's the Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs under Churchill. He's basically running foreign affairs for Churchill. That's a pretty big name. And he's actually in charge of getting the front organization set up in Boston. Again, these are all kind of the secret files. And then when I opened up a secret file at the archives in London and saw the letterhead from Boylston Street in Boston, then I knew I had a book. I was like, this is just crazy. Yeah. So the secret declassified files in Boston have Frances Sweeney's signature on it. That's actually an original letter. So it's I can explain. It's a little bit technical about what these actual documents are, but I can explain that in the Q&A. So what the British wanted to do was they wanted to go ahead and pressure the local police commissioner, Joe Timilty, and Robert Bushnell, the Attorney General, to actually take Moran off the scene, because the Christian Front were holding meetings, they were producing a lot of anti-Semitic literature, they were basically anti-Roosevelt literature, and he was working for Scholz. And so the idea was by the British to use the Irish American Defense Association to picket meetings of the Christian Front, create disturbances that the police could use, and to shut down Moran. And so what they did was, Moran was passing out books that were published by an indicted alleged Nazi agent at the time, and he was doing this in Hibernian Hall when the Boston police rushed in and took his books away from him and told him that those books were banned in Boston. But they actually weren't banned in Boston. Under the First Amendment, he had every right to pass out such literature because it had not been deemed enemy propaganda, because the author of the literature had only been indicted, not convicted. So consequently, this pushed Moran underground. Timilty, who again, Timilty, I know it's a big Boston political name, so I have to be careful here, but let's just say that it wasn't the Coconut Grove fire that got Timilty relieved from his position. There's more and more evidence that his handling of the Christian Front is what did it. Bushnell was furious. So again, this is information from one of the informants, informant T1, when Moran goes underground now. He tells Commissioner Moran that he's going to disband the organization, but he doesn't. It goes into a cell structure. And then this is what he says to one of the informants in one of the meetings of the cell. And so he wants to use returning veterans from World War II who are sufficiently trained in weaponry to exterminate Jews in the U.S., which is extremely chilling. Then in 1943, there is Irish Catholic on Jewish violence in Boston. The historian Stephen Norwood has written about this. Other historians have written about this. What my book does is it traces the beginnings of the violence back into the spring of 1943 and late 1942 using U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps records. But it was quite brutal violence that broke out in Mattapan, Dorchester, Blue Hill. What I argue in the book, or exactly what I insinuate in the book, is that this is my thesis. When you take a charismatic leader and chop off the head of his organization, it atomizes. And in this case, I argue, what emerged was gang warfare. That Moran had successfully anti-Semitized a whole cadre of people in Boston to become hateful of Jews. And then, because of Timilty's kind of inept handling of Moran, they pushed him underground. And he was more devious underground. And what emerged, though, was this whole cohort of Bostonians who had been so riled up against the Jews that the gang violence emerged. And that Francis Sweeney, who had pressured Timilty to take down Moran in a blaze of glory, that backfired. And that caused, I see a causal relationship between the violence in Boston and the direct effect of the British intelligence operation in Boston that was going on in 1941, 1942 to take out Moran. Because when you chop the head off of the organization, you cannot monitor him. They couldn't get an informant into the Christian Front cell structure for over a year. So all during the period of the violence in Boston, they had no idea whether or not Scholz and Moran were actually contriving this violence. And in many ways, I think it's the sad blowback from what I see as a very efficient covert operation run by the British. It was a seamless, it was a beautiful operation. But the problem I see is that, the circus comes to town and the tents go up and they put on their show and they do their magic act. Then they take the tents down, the circus leaves town, and it's the locals who are left with having to deal with the results of what is in fact a deceptive operation on the part of a foreign country. And in this case, the British CIA was doing that all through the 40s and 50s, 60s. So I kind of have a little, I see correlations there. Scholes is eventually arrested in 1946 in Italy. He escapes to Latin America through the good offices of Cardinal Fossati of Milan, who wrote him a nice letter of recommendation. Here we go. I'd like to thank Richard Brightman for allowing me to have a copy of that. And then he does the usual. He goes down to Latin America. He goes first to Buenos Aires, where he has an affair with the former wife of Count Oleg Cassini, remember the fashion designer for Jackie O? She was a big Nazi sympathizer. He had an affair with her for about 6 months in Buenos Aires. Then she got sick of him talking about how Hitler was going to make a comeback, whatever, ditched him, and then he went to Bolivia and bought a copper mine. Not after having visited with the Krupp family before he left. This is a line that I like to end with because it's a little more upbeat, but the context is not so upbeat. Francis Sweeney, who many see as the hero in this saga, dies suddenly in 1944 at age 37 of a heart ailment while she's walking down the street. And her fiancé at the time wrote a letter, and this is one of the lines that you can read about how the memory of Francis Sweeney should inspire kind of all of us to carry on the good work that she was doing, her work against Catholic anti-Semitism and anti-fascism. And then these are just a few points about why I think the Christian Front story has never been told. The first is the position or the notion that was put forward about it by a Harvard sociologist named Seymour Martin Lipset in the 1960s. And he's just offering his observation here, and he just says that a history of these groups, these right-wing groups like the Christian Front, really hasn't been written because they didn't have any impact on electoral outcomes. In other words, they weren't significantly powerful in terms of the ballot, of the voting booth. And consequently, it's groups like that get left behind. So I see that. In fact, I think that's how the right wing gets treated in a lot of, the history of the right wing gets treated in a lot of ways. The other reason is that World War II came along and the New York insurrectionists were forgotten because the war was all consuming. By January of 1942, Moran had been taken out. Also in the book, the Russians tried to get into South Boston to take Moran out as well. There's a Russian spy operation as well. Then there are professional sensitivities. From the 1950s through the 1990s, because most in the historical, so when I was in grad school, all my professors were Marxists, right? So they, I went to grad school where the joke was there were more Marxists in Binghamton than there were in Berlin. More communists in Binghamton than there were in Berlin. So consequently, if I tried to write a dissertation on a right-wing Christian militant group, the perspective is, well, we don't want to give, A, we don't want to give that academic credibility, and B, we don't want to, are you trying to glorify, there's skepticism about whether you're trying to glorify these people. And that was kind of the skepticism that I think was in the profession. I always thought that there were, because of the religious component and because of the national security component, I always thought there were huge, I thought this was a huge story, and I had for 20 years. I just couldn't get anybody to publish it. My publisher of my first book dumped it. They rejected it. So I had to figure out something else. Worked out in the long run, but. And then there's the First Amendment issue. There are Fourth Amendment issues here. There are, free speech issues, religious expression issues. They were very, very trepidatious about search and seizure, Fourth Amendment issues, reasonable search and seizure on a religious organization, surveillance on a religious organization. So I think for all these reasons, I think that's why the subtitle of the book is The Forgotten History of the Christian Front, which pushes me, it's really hard to publicize a book about a topic which everyone's forgotten. So it turns me into a bit of a salesman. So I would encourage you to purchase the book so that you can be up to date on all this stuff, because it's really hard to kind of get publicity for a group that no one's ever heard of. But I thank everyone for hearing about it tonight, and I thank our technician, and I thank Robert again for the ability to talk about this book. Thank you very much.
So folks, let's take 10 minutes of audience questions. I do have a question that was emailed to me, and again, I would remind those that are at home to email me any questions or comments you have for Mr. Gallagher. So I'll start with the emailed question, and then we'll go to folks in the room to see if they have any questions. But the question is very basic, and you touched on it a little bit at the beginning and then at the end. But basically, how did you become aware of all of this?
Yeah, so it's a couple of different paths here. The first 2 points of interest, points of contact, were personal. When I was an undergraduate, I think I mentioned, I took a course on U.S. security history, and I needed to write the usual 10-page research paper at the end of the course. And so, as a history geek, I was looking through old microfilms of old newspapers, and I saw the picture of the guys with the rifles. And then when I looked more closely, it said that they were followers of this Catholic priest. And I thought, wow, that's pretty wild. And so that image stuck in my mind, and that's when I went to my professor as an undergraduate, and I said, I'd like to do my research paper on this topic, and he dissuaded me. He dissuaded me from writing the research paper. So then when I was in graduate school, I became I went to do a master's degree in religious history. My parents had a summer home on Nantucket, and my father was cleaning out the basement in our house there. And we came across my grandfather's scrapbook. For those of you of a younger generation online, a scrapbook is what Facebook is today, except it contained newspaper clippings and photographs. And my grandfather, because he wasn't a follower, but because it was of great interest, he kept news clippings about the Christian Front case. My grandfather seemed to think this was a very strange and interesting case, and I found, for example, news clippings in his scrapbook that I have not been able to locate electronically about the FBI raid in particular. And I thought to myself, if this is a guy in 1940 who, my grandfather ran a gas station, so he's a working class Catholic intellectual, I call him, and he's reading about this case, and he thinks it's worthy of remembering. I think it's worthy of remembering too, and I felt I really want to dig into this. So when I wrote my first book, it was about Vatican diplomacy. So it was all about Vatican diplomats and popes in World War II, and this group kept popping up in the Vatican. So I thought in the back of my mind, I said, I think for my next book, I really want to kind of double down on this, and it's not just an American thing, it has international implications, as you find out in the book, and also at the Vatican. So that's what did it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And that question was from Sharon, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. You have a question? Yep. And you know what? I'm going to have you hold the microphone.
Was there any special connection to the universities, this group? I mean, at well-known or prestigious universities, were they infiltrating as spies or whatever?
Yeah.
Because it seems like just different things I've come across or read about influence at some of the universities.
Yeah.
I've always wondered about it.
So it's a very good question. The question is about whether there's connectivity between the prestigious universities and this group. I think I'll answer the question by bookending the group that's the Christian Front, by saying that one of the things that I really liked about the group is that they were not intellectuals. These were working class Catholics who worked jobs in manufacturing, in the factories, on the street. They were ordinary people, but they were bookended, in other words, by people who had access to prestigious universities. For example, Arnold Lund, who came up with the concept of the Christian Front, had two very important lectures at Boston College in 1937 where he spoke about the Spanish Civil War. I don't know if Moran was in the audience for these lectures, but it was as anti-communistic and as militantly anti-communistic as you could have at that time, and that was at Boston College. Harvard University was a target for Scholes in terms of recruitment of agents, and he was successful. He recruited a young student at Harvard named Dale Maple, who was the first American ever to be convicted of treason with the judgment of being hanged. The first student. There was William Colpaw, who was an MIT student, was also recruited by Scholes, and he was sent to a spy school in Germany and then offloaded off the coast of Maine on a German U-boat in 1944. And so Scholes was particularly adept at recruiting at New England universities. So while the Christian Front is largely working class, non-intellectual, but deeply theological. See, that's the thing. This is I get pushback on this, but people, I think there's such a thing as a working class intellectual. And I think elites don't understand that working class, ordinary folk can be very bright, if not brilliant, in their conceptualization of ideas. And they dismiss them because they don't have the right degree. But I think that's very premature and immature in a lot of ways. Sure.
All right, I'm going to ask a question, online question, then I'll get to you, sir. So question online comes from Joyce. This was a wonderful and enlightening presentation. Yay. Is there any interest in turning the book into a documentary or even a movie?
Well, the answer is yes. So the movie rights have been sold for a short period of time to a small company, which I'm not going to mention on YouTube, but a small documentary company has purchased the rights, and And I'm in contact with the producer, and we're kind of crossing our fingers about that. So it was really great news.
Yeah,
Thanks.
congratulations.
Thank you. Yep.
All right, sir, coming to you.
Can you tell me a little bit about that professor at Boston College who is promoting membership?
Yeah.
That's rather striking to me.
Yeah. So Father Thomas Ahern was a Jesuit at the Weston Observatory, but he was also kind of a polymath. He created one of the first fire suppression systems using foam. He was also a botanist, and he started that observatory. He was regionally quite famous, and he had his own radio show, which ran from Portland, Maine, all the way to southern Connecticut. So his radio show was quite popular. It was called something like Catholic Answer Hour. And he followed Father Coughlin on Sundays. Father Coughlin would be in the early afternoon, and then Father Ahern would come on. So he was very, the calculus for Catholics was what to do about communism. That global communism felt thoroughly empowered to take up arms and execute Catholics. So for example, most people don't know this, but 6,500 priests, seminarians, and nuns were murdered, summarily executed. 10% of the diocesan clergy in the Diocese of Madrid were put up against a wall and executed by the communists during the Spanish. So what Coughlin is doing on the airwaves, kind of it's the first kind of social media. He's out there on social media combining communism and Judaism, but with a twist. He's saying these communists, these communists are just secular Jews who have adopted this ideology as their new religion. Coughlin says, we have nothing to fear from God-fearing Jews. So those Jews that have not kind of fallen away from religious practice, we have nothing to fear about. The Orthodox, the conservative, I guess the Hasids are also growing at this time. So he says, those Jews who believe in God, we have solidarity with. But he's claiming that Lenin and Marx were Jews who created their own secular religion, which was not only global, but was centered on world domination and the eradication of Christianity. Whereas Nazism, under the influence of Alfred Rosenberg, was not about the eradication of Christianity. It was about the reform of Christianity. Rosenberg told Hitler that the real problem wasn't Jesus, it was Paul. It was St. Paul, because Paul input Judaism back into the gospel. And that, because Jesus, of course, according to Rosenberg, was Nordic. He was from somewhere in Sweden or something like that. You can read about that in other places. But yeah, so the calculus was, do we side with, who do we empathize with? Who do we sympathize with? Well, the communists are going to roughshod, just eradicate Christianity, at least for, and it was a very strange situation because the Nazis weren't in any way trying to, the Nazis were just as brutal against organized Roman Catholicism and Christianity as the communists were. So it's a very strange calculus. Yeah.
So is there anyone else in the room that would like to ask one final question? All right, sir.
What became of Schultz afterwards? Was he neutralized after World War II, or did he just disappear down in Bolivia? Or
yeah, so he married a Yugoslavian countess. In 1958, he petitioned the newly formed German Democratic Republic for his pension, claiming that he was a diplomat. And technically, so all the documents that survived the war indicated that he, so for example, the diplomatic lists all indicate that he was a diplomat, he was a consul. So he claimed his pension, he married his Yugoslavian heiress, and about in June, I was able to travel just outside of Munich to a beautiful place called Lake Starnberg, and he resided in a villa there with his countess until his death in 1985.
Well, we'll end it on that note. So let's give Mr. Gallagher one more big round of applause.
Thank you.